I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. Today I'm speaking to author and journalist Kate Bradbury. Kate specialises in wildlife gardening and I was keen to talk to her because she walks the walk as well as talking the talk, having stewardship over an allotment and her own garden, plus a seemingly insatiable appetite for immersing herself in the natural world and learning how it all works. We talk about the best ways to garden for wildlife, including what to put in your wildlife garden and what to leave out. Kate champions some unusual species and our conversation touches upon aspects that may surprise even the most seasoned wildlife gardener. The timing was perfect too, as Kate's new book, Wildlife Gardening for Everyone and Everything, hit the shelves 5 days ago. Once she's tempted you with snippets of wildlife gardening gold, you can go and buy the book and find out everything you need to know about turning your own garden, whatever its size, into a haven for all creatures great and small. One of the first things that you mention in your book is providing shelter for wildlife, and I think that's something that we quite often overlook. So can you talk a bit about what we should be doing?
Shelter's just somewhere to rest. So that can include somewhere to hibernate or somewhere to breed or somewhere to just sit out the rain if it's raining or if it's cold. So shelter is anything from a hedge or a tree or a pile of leaves or a pile of plant pots or a bit of long grass, just where wildlife can go. And different species have different requirements. So a hedge, for example, will always be full of house sparrows, which seem to really love shrubby cover. So they can just sit and chirp in it all day and not really do anything. To a pond where you've got the shelter for frogs and other amphibians and other invertebrates that breed in water. So it's basically somewhere to hang out, I suppose.
And is clothing things with plants part of that as well?
Clothing things, yes, exactly. So if you've got a bare wall, there's not much shelter there. If you've got a wall that's covered in climbers, then there's a lot more shelter. It's just providing nooks and crannies. It doesn't have to be nesting. It doesn't always have to be nesting space. It depends on your garden and the capabilities of your garden. But yeah, so climbers on the wall, hedges, trees, shrubs, long grass, piles of things in the corner, habitat piles they're called. Yeah, bits and pieces for the tiniest things to the biggest things to literally take shelter.
And if you could include 3 elements in your wildlife garden, what would be the most important ones for you to have?
A hedge. It would be a native hedge, so a mixed native hedge comprising hawthorn largely. I wouldn't go for buckthorn in a garden unless you had a huge garden because it suckers. Things like wild cherry, hazel, spindle, elder, they all make really nice hedges. So a hedge would be my number one. And actually my garden's too small to have a hedge, but I'm clothing my walls and my fences with climbers, predominantly ivy and hops and honeysuckle, which are all native climbers. So they provide leaves for leaf munchers as well as flowers for pollinators. So that would be my number one. Number 2 would be a pond, where obviously amphibians can breed, but also invertebrates that have aquatic larvae and also aquatic invertebrates can breed. Birds, if you've got a shallow enough beachy area around, then birds will wash in there, they will bathe in there, and hedgehogs and other small mammals can drink in there as well. But you do need to have very shallow edges at the sides so that they don't fall in and come a cropper.
So what would be your 3rd one?
My 3rd one, I think long grass actually. I think it would probably be a toss-up between pollinator plants and long grass. Well, in most gardens you have flowers for pollinators, and that's really important. But the amount of wildlife that comes to your garden in long grass. So on my allotment, all of my allotment neighbours have very pristine plots, and I've got long grass growing, and I'm the only one that gets grasshoppers and crickets and slow worms and all of those lovely things that take shelter in long grass. So yeah, I think pollinator plants would come a close fourth to that, I think, but okay. long grass.
Well, that actually brings me on nicely to the next question, which is, if you could pick 3 plants, what would they be?
Again, actually, I'd pick hawthorn Because for me, having a small garden, I try to make each plant work as hard as possible. So I want it to have more than one use for wildlife. So with the hawthorn, it attracts about 300 insects. It's amazing. So there's loads of different moth species and fly species that lay eggs on the leaves. You've got other critters that hide amongst the bark. Bees obviously feed on the flowers in spring, and then the flowers turn into berries, which feed the birds in autumn. Birds will also pick off the insects from the bark, pick off the caterpillars from the leaves. And then if you've got a mature tree or you turn it into a hedge, then it provides shelter to nest for birds. And then obviously, if you're really lucky, then hedgehogs can make little nests beneath it in the leaf litter as well. So hawthorn's an amazing all-rounder that just has loads and loads of different uses for different species of wildlife. So that would be my number one. Viper's bugloss would be my number two because it's one of the best bee plants and it's really gorgeous as well. I had these lovely tall spires of blue flowers with very pink stamens, and the flowers fill up with nectar very quickly after they've been depleted. And so the bees can just feed and feed and feed and feed all day. And they're just wonderful. My third would be, I think, apple, actually, because apple blossom comes out at the same time as the red mason bees. They pretty much come out on the same day, normally, although the red mason bees have been a bit early this year. So for me, apple blossom, it's a real sign of spring, a bit like the hawthorn, really. And I know that when the apple blossom comes out, then that's the bees coming out and then everything's going to start nesting. And red mason bees and apple blossom have this wonderful symbiotic relationship, and they're very efficient pollinators of apple blossom. And again, the leaves are used by various moths. The flowers provide food for bees. The apples, the windfall apples that you don't take for yourself, feed butterflies and birds in autumn. And then, lots of other bits and pieces hang out in the nooks and crannies. And then mistletoe as well will make a little home on the bark, which then in turn feeds mistle thrushes and other birds. So apples are a really good thing to grow. And they're really good for small gardens as well. Even if you're just growing a espalier apple along a wall, it just provides lots of food and shelter for a number of different species.
And I might be covering a later question here as well. You mentioned that there are some things that will lay eggs on leaves. Is there anywhere we can go and find out that kind of information about the life cycle so that we're not cutting things back at the wrong time?
I think a lot more research needs to be done. And I think in terms of cutting things back at the wrong time, I touch on that in my book, both of my practical books actually, but I don't think there's anything specific that I can think of that gives you detailed pruning advice on how to avoid harming wildlife. I would love to see RHS advice on its website and in its books. This is the time of year to prune, but this is the time of year to prune to avoid harming wildlife. So mixed native hedges, for example, so butterfly conservation, they always recommend that you prune the hedge every other year because some butterflies and moths, their life cycle is such that they overwinter as eggs on the branches of the plants. So if you're pruning every winter, then you're just removing that generation each year. And if you do it every year, then obviously it's not going to be long before there's nothing left to prune away. Things like nettles, I have a real problem on my allotment because there's a huge bank of nettles all the way around. It's one of the largest allotments in Hove. And there's just nettles all around the periphery of the allotment. And they are in mid-July covered in caterpillars, and then around the third week of July the council comes and chops all the nettles down. So I've been sort of campaigning to get that moved back to September so that the butterflies can complete their life cycle, but in the meantime I have to go and pick all the caterpillars off and put them on my nettles, which really hurts my hands actually.
That takes a fair bit of time as
well, does a little bit, yeah. Labour of love.
So obviously the council's not getting it quite right.
I don't think most councils don't. They'll say things like, oh, but we're creating these habitats here and there. Whenever I complain to the council, they say, oh, but we're very wildlife friendly. We've let this bed free here and we've done this. And I'm like, but if you prune the elm trees every winter, then the white letter hair streak butterfly is going to suffer because it overwinters as an egg or a caterpillar on the branch tips of the tree. So you're going to be removing those species from the trees. And I think it's just being sensitive to knowing when to prune things. Wildlife gardening for me is about providing shelter, obviously. It's about providing food. It's about providing water. It's about providing a place for wildlife to live. But it's also a huge amount of that is about getting to know the wildlife. So if you get to know your plants and you get to know the species that live on or among those plants, then you know when to prune. You know that your nettles shouldn't be cut down until September because you go out and you see them and you watch them and you understand the life cycles involved. And so, yes, there probably should be a book or some information online. But in the meantime, we can all just get to know our plants and our gardens and our wildlife a little bit better.
Yeah, there is a lot to learn. And as I said to you when I came in, we sometimes think we're doing good, but actually we're doing more harm than good. What do you think are some of the most common things that people get wrong if they're trying to help out wildlife?
One of my bugbears is when you find a frog in the garden and you pick it up and you put it in the pond. A lot of people do that because there's this association of frogs with water. And it's not too bad if you do that in summer. The frogs don't need to be in a pond in summer. Frogs, they only need to be in water to breed. And as long as they have a damp shelter throughout the rest of the year, then they're completely fine. And sometimes in hot weather, they will take shelter in the pond. But the important thing is that they put themselves in the pond and you don't put them in the pond. But in winter, actually, particularly newts and toads, they shrivel up their skin and they go and hide beneath stones and logs and things like that. So it can actually be quite damaging if you put them in ponds because they deliberately don't want to be in a pond. Some frogs will overwinter at the bottom of ponds, but still I wouldn't put a frog into a freezing cold water if you found it under a log. So yeah, I think that's one thing that people do. I think there's growing evidence that putting up a bee hotel and then leaving it there can do more harm than good. It's thought that because solitary bee habitats in the wild are quite temporary, so typically red mason bees and leafcutter bees, they nest in the hollow stems of old plants, last year's plants that just fell down and weren't cleared away, or in holes made in wood by wood-boring beetles. Again, the wood has to be quite old in order for the beetles to do that. So these are both quite temporary habitats. And then if we're putting up a bee hotel, which is quite a permanent habitat, suddenly it's there for sort of 5 years. And over that time, the bees tend to just go nest back in it, as do their predators and their parasites. And fungal infections can build up as well. There's a fungal infection called chalk brood, which is a infection of honeybees that has jumped over into wild bees. And so just by putting up a bee hotel and just leaving it there, that can actually cause more harm than good because you're actually giving an advantage to the predators and the parasites and the diseases rather than the bees themselves. So I clean my bee hotel out every autumn and I overwinter the bees in the shed. And I don't kill the parasites. Some people do kill the parasites and the predators, but I overwinter them separately so that they're still alive in spring, but they just don't quite have the head start that they would have had if I'd just left everything in the bee hotel together.
Okay. And what parasites are there?
Some of them are parasitic wasps, which are actually really gorgeous. There's a fly called, it's sappy something. It's got a really long name and its poo looks like little maggoty hairs. It's like all bunched up. Yeah, little flies, little wasps, things that lay eggs in the cocoons and they eat the bees. Houdini fly, that's what it's called. It's called Houdini fly. And that's a really common predator of red mason bees and leafcutter bees. And they can decimate whole bee hotels and then they overwinter in there with the bees. When the remaining bees come out in spring and then go back into the hotel to breed, they don't have to go anywhere to find more prey.
And you do mention flies in your book, actually, and you talk about gardening for flies, which even for a wildlife lover like me is quite radical. Can you talk a bit about what we should be doing for flies?
I mean, there's a lot of flies. So I've just talked about one fly that's a predator of bees, but the world of flies is absolutely enormous. And I think the thing to remember is that flies are at the bottom of the food chain or very close to the bottom of the food chain. Obviously, I've just discussed one that predates bees, but anything that's at the bottom of the food chain we should worship because it just provides food for everything else further up the food chain. So what eats flies? Frogs, birds, spiders, wasps. And so, they're just food. And all the maggots, all the things that eat maggots, fly maggots. I mean, some species of fly literally clean our shit. They literally disappear. If there was no flies, then our streets would be covered in it. And they do an amazing job breaking down organic matter. They are very much part of the life cycle, the carbon cycle, the breakdown of garden waste. They're food for other species. You know, people think of flies and they think of blue bottles that sit on fox poo and then come and sit on your food. But actually, there's so many millions of flies. I mean, bee flies, for example, which are out at the moment, are so gorgeous. And they look like little bees with a really long proboscis, and they fly with their proboscis out, which is really cute. Hoverflies, of course, they're all flies. Actually, if you look at a blue bottle or a green bottle, they're really beautiful if you look at them really close up. You know, the broad centurion fly is a really lovely fly. There's some really gorgeous flies out there, and we should take heed and get to know them a bit more and create habitats for them in our gardens.
Yeah, because as you say as well about the butterflies and the moths, it's not just a case of their numbers dropping and that being a problem for their sake, it's what relies on them. And it is quite scary, actually, the butterfly and the moth declines. Can you just talk a little bit about the overall trends and what knock-on effects they may have for other species?
I mean, moths, for example, moths are not as well loved as butterflies, which is really sad. A lot of people have these weird associations with moths flying into your hair and, you know, being a bit creepy, which I find very sad. So in the southeast, where we both live, moth declines have been a lot more pronounced than in other areas. There's the garden tiger, for example, which is an amazing, it's so beautiful. It's got sort of creamy white and blue, black spotted wings with these red underwings. And it's called the garden tiger, presumably because at one stage it was really common in gardens. And even my mum, who doesn't really have a huge affinity with wildlife, she knows the garden tiger because she used to play with the caterpillars as a kid with her siblings. And the caterpillars are called woolly bear caterpillars. And they're these huge, big brown caterpillars with this sort of mohican. I tend to see them in April and May on the allotment because they're breeding on my allotment. And they're always looking for a little place to go and pupate and turn into an adult moth. But they've declined in the southeast by 92% in the last 40 years, which is huge. And they just don't breed in gardens anymore. And I think the reason for that is because they breed on nettles, docks, dandelions, burdocks. And we, as gardeners, have been encouraged to remove those from our gardens, to not grow them. They're weeds, they're pernicious, all these awful things. And our gardens have, as a result, become tidier and more sterile, really. They emerge from hibernation in sort of March, early April. They feed up, they get really fat, and then they go and pupate. So they're pupating in summer. So in summer, they need an undisturbed compost heap or a pile of leaves or a twig pile or shelter, basically, you know, as we were talking about earlier. And again, summer's the time when gardeners are out sweeping things up and, you know, putting things on the compost heap, which might be okay if it's a nice open compost heap so that they can take shelter and then find their way out. But if it's a closed heap, which again is more common these days, then they're less likely to be able to survive. I've got them breeding on my allotment, which makes me incredibly proud. And that's because I have a huge bank of nettles and docks and 2 open compost heaps made of pallets, which I don't touch. And I'm really grateful for that. And I've brought some nettles and docks from the allotment to my new garden, and I'm going to be having a little wild patch here, and we'll see if I can get them to live here as well. The world of moths, I think we should all just get to know them a bit better, really. I mean, they're really gorgeous things and they're really important. People talk about moths being indicator species in that they indicate the general state of the environment. So the fact that moths are declining means that something's wrong. If you get something from that, then fine. I don't think that really means much to the average person. But I think if you remember that before moths are moths, they're caterpillars, and caterpillars are eaten by baby birds. So a blue-tit chick needs 100 caterpillars a day for 3 weeks. Wow. And if you think about the 6 blue-tit tits in a nest, that's 600 caterpillars a day. You know, that's several thousand caterpillars over a 3-week period. Most blue-tit nests in urban areas fail because there's just not enough caterpillars to feed their babies. So that's pretty intense. Hedgehogs, lots of people think, oh, hedgehogs eat slugs and snails. They actually mostly eat beetles and caterpillars. So hedgehogs are declining. Frogs, toads, newts, when the caterpillars fall to the ground to pupate, they'll be snaffled up by frogs, toads, newts, field mice, things like that. So there's just a huge, huge range of wildlife that eats caterpillars. And so, yes, by growing the plants that bring the caterpillars in, we are potentially increasing the number of adult moths that we have around, which would potentially reverse declines, but also it could reverse the declines of all of the things that eat them as well, which is pretty incredible, really. I mean, if we all got together, if every gardener in the land got together and planted something, a caterpillar food plant for a moth or a butterfly, I mean, where would that leave us in 10 years' time? I think there'd be quite a lot of blue tits around, certainly, and that made me really happy.
That's interesting, actually, because one of the things that I thought when I was reading your latest book was that you mention people with smaller gardens and even balconies. And the common thinking at the moment is if you've got a smaller garden or a balcony, probably don't worry too much. Leave it to the people with the medium-sized gardens and the large gardens. But actually, I do wonder if that's a bit of a cop-out. I think we've all got to take one for the team. We've all got to plant that patch of nettles.
We have. You don't have to grow nettles if you've got a really small garden or a balcony, but you can grow forget-me-not. You can grow foxgloves. You can grow primroses. These are native flowering plants that some species of moth will lay eggs on. So you can have caterpillar food plants growing in a pot. For example, I was living in London. I had a tiny, tiny garden that was shaded for most of the day and was just in between loads of buildings and two very main roads and beneath a train track. And I grew forget-me-not in a corner. And one day I watched a great tit come in and it hovered over the forget-me-not like a kestrel. And then it dived in and the whole bush started shaking. And then it emerged a few seconds later with this enormous green caterpillar in its beak. So honestly, you can have a windowsill. And if you grow forget-me-not, primrose, foxglove, probably wouldn't grow foxgloves on a windowsill, but forget-me-not and primrose certainly. And you can provide nectar and pollen for spring pollinators, but you can also provide food for caterpillars, which is just a little bit more food for birds. And they'll find it because they're so desperate in spring, they'll look for it.
So the other thing you talk about as well, which again, I think will surprise people, is light pollution.
Yes.
Do we know enough about that and the effects of it?
I think there's some studies being done on light pollution and bats, which I'm not sure I did mention in the book, actually. But basically, there's only one species of bat, which is the common pipistrelle, which will happily feed from streetlights. So moths particularly are attracted to streetlights. They're attracted to light. And that potentially, the theory is, and I think it's a theory, it's assumed that this is what's happening, is that the streetlights take the moths and the other insects that are attracted to light away from the other areas of shelter where insects would normally gather, which is where the bats will look for them. But pipistrelle bats have been shown to benefit from streetlights because they have learnt to just go to the streetlights to get the insects. But most of the species of bat suffer from this. And then light in gardens or light near gardens has been shown to bring birds into the garden. Is it a bit earlier, I think? A lot of people have solar lights in their gardens and things like that. I don't, because I just like to keep the garden as dark as possible, because I just think, well, it's going to disturb the insects. They're going to think it's the daytime, or they're going to, it doesn't sit right with me. And then the birds, obviously, in urban areas, we do have robins and wrens and sometimes blackbirds singing all through the night rather than starting up in the morning. And you just wonder how much energy they're using to do that. Some studies have been shown on robins and blackbirds that sing through the night. It affects their quality of fatherhood as parents. I have read these papers several years ago, so I can't remember what they said exactly, but there have been studies that have just looked at the effect this is having on the birds, and it tends to be a negative effect. So I don't like my garden. However, my garden backs onto a close of a new build estate, and there's a street light there. So probably is affecting the wildlife in my garden anyway.
Yeah, it's a problem that I don't think enough people consider.
And when you're talking about safety of people, then that kind of has to come first. I quite like these streetlights where you're walking along the roads and then it just comes on. rather than stays on all night.
Yeah.
Better for climate change as well.
Yeah, and also when people move to rural areas, I think they have this, especially if they've come from cities, have this desire to light it up because it's so dark.
Really?
But of course it's dark. It's in the middle of nowhere, and that's kind of how it should be. But hey ho. One last thing that you mentioned in your book that I think is a problem, and again, a lot of people don't consider it, is netting.
Yeah. Netting's a big one. I mean, there's a huge thing at the moment about netting because developers appear to be netting hedges and trees to stop birds nesting in them so that they can get planning permission to chop them down, which is just the most barbaric thing ever. In gardens, people don't think about netting. Well, I suppose you don't think about netting until you find something dead trapped in the netting, and then suddenly you do think about the netting. But pea netting, for example, in order for it not to harm a hedgehog, it needs to be lifted 15 centimetres off the ground, which is about 4 inches. But I know someone who lifted the netting off the ground and then got a tawny owl trapped in the netting. I mean, I don't use any plastic on the allotment at all, really. I don't use netting. I don't use weed suppressant membrane, the stuff that you lay down to stop the weeds growing, because it all splinters and it all breaks down. And then you just find little pieces of it in the soil. And I'm just forever picking up other people's little bits of plastic from my soil. And it's really annoying. There are plenty of things you can grow your peas up that don't involve netting or plastic netting that is not harmful at all to wildlife. Pea sticks, for example. And, if you buy a fat ball from quite a cheap bird or pet shop or something like that to feed the birds, it's really important that you take the fat ball out of the netting, because birds, they can get their feet or leg trapped in there. Often, you'll find the birds have finished feeding on the fat ball and then the netting will fall to the ground. You might get a grass snake trapped in there or a little small mammal or something like that. There are so many different things that can get caught in netting. It's not just netting. I mean, even, things like elastic bands. Hedgehogs think they're worms and they eat them and then they die. There's lots of things that we use in gardens that we shouldn't be using in gardens because they really harm wildlife. And I think we just need to spend more time thinking about wildlife, because if we don't, there won't be any wildlife left to worry about. And then where would we be?
We'd be stuffed. So apart from your book, which is fabulous, where can other people go and find out more good resources if people do want to wildlife garden and they don't want to do silly things to harm wildlife?
The Butterfly Conservation website is good. If you want to get to know the butterflies that visit your garden, then visit Butterfly Conservation. Take part in the big butterfly count in summer, which just gets you out there looking at butterflies and learning to identify the different species. Its sister website is called Moths Count, and that's got a really good list of caterpillar food plants. There are lists of caterpillar food plants in my book, obviously. So you can have a go at growing things that will bring the caterpillars in, which will then feed everything else that eats them, which is a lot. Frog Life has got a really good website if you want to get to know the amphibians in your garden. Bumblebee Conservation Trust has got lots of advice on growing plants for pollinators. And the BTO, they've done loads of research on different types of things. So, if you want to actually sort of look at some sort of studies on the feeding habits of various birds and other wildlife, then the BTO's got lots of really important resources there too.
I will put links to all of those in the show notes. And when was your book released and how can people get hold of it?
My book, Wildlife Gardening for Everyone and Everything, is out on the 18th of April. It's available from all good bookshops. It's affiliated with the RHS and the Wildlife Trusts, so you could buy it through them, which would give them a bit of a boost. It's also available online and from all good bookshops.
A huge thank you to Kate for taking the time to share her knowledge with us. Please do pick up a copy of her new book if you like what she had to say. And can I recommend her previous book, The Bumblebee Flies Anyway? It was a game changer for me in terms of how I garden. Thanks to you two for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.